Well, hello. Thank you very much for giving us the opportunity to present the scheme again. My name's Toby Jevons. I'm an associate partner at Rogers Stirk Harbour, and I was also the project architect for the new Macallan distillery. So, just press a bit harder. So, back in 2012, we had an international competition which we were invited to participate in, and we were lucky enough to win. I've placed this slide, which is called Easter Elkys House, and it's the ancestral brand home of Macallan. And really, the purpose of the project was to create both increasing capacity, which was to take the existing production facility from 9 million litres of annual spirit production up to, at the time of the competition, an unknown disclosed figure. We had to demonstrate a phasing opportunity within the concept. And it was also important that this house, Easter Elkys, was centrally located in the concept that the new proposal didn't overshadow it, and that there was a physical and symbolic relationship and connection between the new facility and Easter Elkys. Obviously, during the process of research, we visited the existing facility, as was at the time. Whisky distilleries in Scotland are very specific, they're very particular to their brand, and the brands make a lot of emphasis out of the very specific shape to their copper stills. These particular curiously small stills, as the Macallan referred to them, actually featured on one of the Scottish £10 notes previously, historically. So there was a huge amount of research that was required to actually understand how to make whisky in the first place. Obviously, as a practice, we're fascinated in how to celebrate the workings of a scheme, and this was a gift as a brief. The site, northeastern Scotland, north bank of the River Spey, this beautiful natural landscape typified by a rolling hillside. It's not a mountainous landscape. We have this lovely little Thomas Telford Victorian bridge at the bottom, incredibly picturesque, and we wanted to make the most of that. During the briefing for the competition and during our research, we realised that the designated site was within an area of great landscape value, which was a protected corridor that tracked along the River Spey, and we immediately wanted to respect that. We wanted to do something as a concept that would mitigate its impact on the landscape. Obviously, the talk that we've lucky enough to win was about process and production, and so we focused on that in the talk. We had this interesting learning curve of how one makes whisky. We didn't have to deal with the malting, which was the very first portion, which was delivered to site, and the maturation is dealt with in additional warehouses. But all of the other component parts we had to get up to speed with, and we would bring those together in a production module, which I'll show in a moment. This was an early render from the rear of the scheme, and the idea of architectural language was interesting. What would we use by way of reference? We had a sort of ancestral home, and we had a sort of disparate collection of warehouse buildings, none of which seemed appropriate. And so the team, particularly Graham Stirk in the office, wanted to look back at something more ancient. We looked back at the Moray Well and the Long Cairn burial mounds and a sort of ancient Scottish earthworks. So the response was to turn our back on the industrial side of the office, of the site, open up the views down to the river, make a connection through to Easter Elkys House, which is the little yellow diagram at the bottom, and phase the production. We had to demonstrate in the competition that we could produce 5 million litres, 10 million litres, 15 million litres, up to 25 million litres. And that was, so we generated a production module of 5 million litres. And we did that by arranging them in a circular arrangement and then being able to demonstrate repetition. So we can see here with the roof peeled off, you can see what was called the mash house, which is the first dome of accommodation to the north, 3 repetitive circular still houses, and the visitor centre, which is towards the south, which has also got the entrance connection back to Easter Elkys, where is a sort of an incision in the landscape, a cut, deliberately focusing for compression, and then you're liberated out into the volume of the visitor centre as you go in. You can see here we introduced a private cellar under the visitor centre as well, and that was deliberately so that one in the narrative of being able to tell how one makes whiskey to a tour to a visitor, that at the end of the journey, having had your drink, your dram, that you're able to see this private cellar at the base, which is a very important part of the Macallan story. They invest more in their timber casks than any other distillery in the world, and the timber was very important. That also contributed to the use of timber in the laminated veneered lumber grid shell roof. We wanted to do something that was the most coordinated distillery and probably the most coordinated production building in the world. And we worked incredibly closely with the production designers, a company called Forsyths, based up in north of Scotland, along with the client as well as a principal client designer. I'm going to bounce through some of these now. We had a dialogue with trying to establish a narrative for how we could control and create a language to how the production equipment might work, so that as one moves through, you can clearly identify the component parts. We communicated this backwards and forwards with Forsyths. We ended up exchange of very detailed models, both between the process engineers and ourselves, integrating into the shell and core. Exchange of models. This is an image of the underbelly of the production area. We also had incredible petrochemical regulations to deal with. This is a highly volatile scheme, and that brought with it its own issues. We had to segregate the process vents out of the environmental accommodation, and it's all naturally ventilated. It's a 90%, the energy steam is 90% from a renewable source, and we also reuse the waste product for a biomass plant, and we're also able to use the low-grade waste heat to heat the adjacent visitor centre. And I'll skip on a little bit further, because this is just identifying the fact that we had to do a bit of R&D within the project to accommodate a 10-metre tall 2-hour compartment line, which was glazed to allow transparency between the visitor centre and the production distillery, but without actually it being fire rated at all. So this is via a drencher sprinkler system. And we had to mock this up, had it tested at the BRE. It passed successfully, thankfully. And then in the last couple of minutes, a quick whiz around some finished photographs. Nearly finished, actually. Had we been able to have submitted the presentation a little bit later, we would have had slightly later photographs. But you can tell these are nearly finished. Some of the landscaping is a little raw. Segregated entrance path into a new car park and visitor approach. This is within the visitor centre. You can see that 10-metre, 2-hour compartment line between the visitor centre and the distillery. Principal still house, 3 of those. Mash house up to the north. This is underneath in the guts of the scheme. This is the plant replacement void, which allows us to take out these copper stills, these delicate copper stills, which will wear naturally over time. And a view from the meadow. The scheme is a Scottish grass meadowland, which is effectively pulled out from the adjacent landscape. And you can see a view from the rear. That's my last slide. You can see that it's a little bit raw there, just at the back during construction. But you can see that there's an expressed grid on the roof. It was a 3-metre timber grid. We wanted to express that structure through on the roof. It was never meant to disappear. It was always meant to be an engineered landscape. And the grid on the top also is a utility zone, so that we have our fire, a lightning grid and irrigation network. So it's a useful functional feature, as well as giving the aesthetic of an engineered form. And that's probably about it, really. You can see that it's aping the rolling landscape of the distant hillside as well.
Two questions. One, the clever diagram you came up with was those circles, but you chose to emphasize the continuity of the space. Actually, I guess 3 questions. Why that? How will it expand, or did you wind up building to the max? And how will that affect the landscape? And the third is the more philosophical question, which is most distilleries I know are not so proud of their machinery. They're proud of the oak they use, the wood they use, the crops they use, the deep craftsman's knowledge they have. But you seem to have foregrounded the equipment part of this. Was that a request from them, or is that just your firm's proud traditions?
Well, perhaps to answer the questions in reverse order, obviously it's a new facility.
Right.
So all of the equipment is new. It's been made from scratch. The existing facility was being maintained and was run and was delivering product for them right up until the point that this new facility was turned on, at which point the old one was switched off. You're right. From a client's perspective, it was clearly it's a risk. They've got to make sure that the product that comes out at the very end is still Macallan. And there was a lot of change management involved in making sure that temperature runs and pipe runs and everything was just so that the end product is exactly as it was. The copper stills are very particular to the Macallan, and there was effectively a death mask made of the original, all handmade again by the same craftsman by Forsyths up the road, who would ordinarily be making incremental replacement and repairs to the existing facilities anyway. It was a big ask to do a whole new facility in one go, but I think everyone stepped up to that challenge. I mean, I think absolutely the timber is vital, and the quality of the water and the quality of the environment, but the quality of the manufactured equipment is just as important in the quality of the spirit.
And they wanted their audience to understand that.
I think they understood the importance of wanting to be able to communicate the narrative of how they make the product. I think it was always very much taking visitors around was always part of the brief, and we wanted to do that. We chose to actually place the visitor centre adjacent to the production facility. That actually wasn't part of the brief. We could have separated these two facilities, and we chose to do that, and we always viewed that the visitor centre was viewed effectively like a reception to the production facility. We always thought that the production facility was the reason why you're there. You didn't want to go and see a visitor centre in isolation and see an exhibit of how you make it. You actually want to go to the home of where it's actually being made. So that was very important, hence the importance of that glazed separating wall between the two facilities. Your first question was about the circular arrangement?
And expansion.
And expansion. Well, the circular arrangement came about because the brief asked for us to demonstrate during the competition. We had to say we could deliver 5 million litres, 10 million litres, 15 million litres. So it was clearly a module of production equipment that could make 5 million litres of product. And traditionally, you would have a separate space where you have your fermenters, and then the product moves from the fermenters into a separate room where all the copper stills are. But we wanted to combine these elements so that you had a dedicated module of production. You're right, we could have done it in other arrangements, but we chose to position them in a circular array. We felt that was more celebratory. The copper stills naturally have to be slightly higher, and we were able to do that. They're the hottest part of the process, so there was a natural opportunity for stack effect under a naturally ventilated roof. And then there are certain built-in voids for future expansion, and in theory, future expansion would happen beyond the end of the building. You'd repeat the same system.
It's an endless system.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
You started with a total different image of Macallan. You showed the old castle or the old house, and this is typical Macallan that we know.
Yes.
From the whiskey, but now you ended up with a completely new thing. Is after that building, because I know they are making these buildings with good architects like this, because of that, their image or their branding is changing as well, or is it staying the same image?
No, I think fundamentally
They will use this building also?
I think they will, but they will maintain the graphic of Easterelke's house as their principal brand identity. But I think if you were to go to the distillery now, and certainly I think now that they have this facility, they're realizing that they have a marketable opportunity. So there is a new brand logo which is derived from this building as well. And there's a particular product run that has this identity associated with it. But I think historically, the history of single malts was that actually the blended product was the predominant whiskey product historically. And you had to be very much, before the market changed and everyone perceived malt whiskies to be of a higher quality, you had to sort of be in the know to know of certain brands, and Macallan were quite self-aware of that idea within a certain consumer group. And when we presented the scheme, they liked the idea that it was slightly enigmatic, that it was sort of a bit self-deferential, and they used the expression of the mystery revealed. So they could see themselves in the scheme, which I think was one of the reasons why we were successful.
Because you made many years ago the Renault factory, I think, Rogers, in a similar effect. So to change the image of the French car from a small car to it's something similar, I think.
Sorry, forgive me.
It was the Renault factory. No.
Oh, right.
No. But many years ago, it was about the cars. Now it's about whiskey, wine, and.
Oh, I see. Yeah. Well.
This image shows quite nicely how the project fits beautifully or interestingly into the landscape. But I didn't understand the other side so well, especially when you showed. Maybe we can go back to the image with the bigger columns.
Yeah.
Did you mean that one?
Yeah, because
Yeah.
I mean, what you know, I mean, the roof is not so heavy, I would think. But why did you choose for these major columns?
Well, I think there was internally, there's a primary, if we go internally for a moment before we come back out, internally there's a primary circular steel ring beam, which the timber structure is both compressive in its dome, and then it becomes a tensile structure between. And that's at that point of inflection between the two forces. That same internal language then migrated outside in the way in which we wanted to support the roof. So it was part of the language of the scheme. I mean, I presume the nature of your question is you perceive it to be larger than necessary.
No, but it is another language than anything else you find in the building itself. So, and I thought of it a wooden roof that you probably would not need these amount of quite heavy columns, but it's also to do with the landscape, maybe what I'm saying. You know that in a way you have this quite beautiful integrated aspect of the landscape, and this line.
Yeah.
What is so powerful.
We also had quite a large snow load to take into account, particularly drifting snow load. There had been a precedent historically where I think it was actually a warehouse rather than a distillery itself, but a Scottish whisky warehouse had collapsed and under snow load.
Okay.
Yeah.
Clear.
Okay.